It's November 2016. After much deliberation, you decide to queue Killer in Dead by Daylight, a choice that is as bold as it is potentially disastrous for your mental health. But you do it anyway. You load onto a map, let's say Auto Haven, and the game begins. Due to some bogus setups, it takes you a while to get your first down. You hang the survivor on a hook, ready to find the next survivor until pop, and another pop, and another. It seems in your hubris you forgot to pressure survivors off gens by choosing to commit to getting it down. What a shame. Anyway, you track down the next survivor and manage to get another down, and yet a generator managed to get almost completed in that time frame. You approach the generator only to realize, hey, you can't really do anything to prevent it from being done. This is November of 2016 after all. You don't have any perks to deal with the generator, you don't have anything to do to stop survivors from completing it, and you don't even have the ability to kick the generator at all. There's literally nothing you can do but hope the survivors don't finish the generator. That was the experience that many early Killer players had to deal with. Other than doing your best to pressure survivors, there was nothing you could do to prevent generators from flying by. And that's not even considering how broken OG brand new parts were, or even just a commodious toolbox with some regular add-ons. It was clear to those players that the pace of Dead by Daylight matches were utterly broken. Things just went too fast, generators got completed too quickly, and players began begging for something to be done about the extremely unfair speed that generators could potentially be finished at. Thus began the ever-present war on gen defense in Dead by Daylight, a constant tug of war between behavior and the players for what was considered fair by the game's standards. Was the game going too fast, or were players just not pressuring survivors enough? Was the game truly broken from a fundamental standpoint? Was this even a problem behavior could truly fix? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today, the history of generator regression and defense in Dead by Daylight, and how it's reshaped over and over again, evolving with the game itself. Join me as we talk about the Unending War on gen defense. As far as objectives go, Dead by Daylight is pretty self-explanatory. However, in that simplicity is where a big problem actually starts. Because generators and their completion, or protection, are so important to the game's speed, it makes it so any flaw with that objective is about as loud and clear as you can possibly get. If generators are going too fast, killers with weaker powers, or even killers who just aren't as experienced with macro play, won't stand much of a chance at all. This creates a massive divide between the killers who have powers that allow them to traverse the map quickly and end chases just as fast, and the killers who can't do those things, hence why tier lists exist at all. However, if there's a broken gen regression perk, or just a killer who is able to dominate in that map control, then survivors might feel like they don't stand much of a chance in the grand scheme of the game. To be fair, this also does rely on how good teams are at communicating, which is why swift teams will always stand a better chance than those who queue by themselves. Anyway, this is why gen speed is such a branching topic. Not only does it create a divide between the two roles of the game due to them being polar opposites in terms of dealing with generators, but it even divides the players on the same side, as there are about a billion different ways for behavior to handle such a fundamental design choice. During the game's lifespan, and especially the early years of Dead by Daylight, generator speed was a very thorny topic for many people to discuss. There were undoubtedly good things that needed to be addressed and nerfed into the ground, such as the previously mentioned OG brand new parts, as they were just blatantly unfair in every possible way. However, for a large majority of other reasons that gen speed was complained about, well, it wasn't as easy to address as it was for brand new parts. You couldn't just nerf gen speed and call it a day, as much as some people really wanted that. No, it was a lot more complicated than that. The obvious answer was to take a look at how the game is fundamentally flawed and attempt to fix those core issues. But instead, behavior attempted to patch up those issues with the band-aids that are perks. Perks would get added and then nerfed and then buffed and then reworked, rinse and repeat. Time and time again, the meta for slowing the game down would shift on a dime and would constantly be getting changed without much warning at all. Truth be told, there aren't many conversations about DBD that are as interesting to cover as how gen defense has evolved over the years. Therefore, I wanted to create a cohesive video highlighting some different eras of gen defense and how they've changed and shaped the game around them. Buckle in and get your counters ready for every time I say gen or generator, because we're diving headfirst into the deep end, starting with the first era of gen defense, or lack thereof. As we've established, gen defense was not something the game really shipped with. Hell, you couldn't even kick generators to regress them when the game came out. If gens had any progress, that progress would be permanent. full stop. Sure, you did have the perks like Thanophobia and Dying Light, which definitely had their uses, but only slowed down generator progress, instead of being used to actually make generators lose the progress they had. Those perks had the potential to be good, and Dying Light specifically saw a lot of use by people who were willing to tunnel out the Obsession for that juicy 25% reduction to repair speed. However, Dying Light also boosted altruistic action, so it was like a double-edged sword. This founded the mentality that you needed to kill someone quickly or you just straight up lost. This made camping and tunneling extremely prominent, especially considering how survivor-sided a large chunk of the maps were, generally speaking. Luckily, many players, including both the survivors and the killer, had a tendency to be a lot worse at the game at the time, which meant this problem wasn't too egregious on launch, but became all too noticeable once players started getting comfortable with the mechanics of the game. I've already talked about this era in considerable depth in some of my other videos, so I won't dive into it too much here, plus there's just not really a lot to talk about. Anyway, once that happened, people really began getting up behavior's ass about how quickly generators were going, and started begging for something to be done to the speed that generators could be completed at. There being literally no mechanic for the killers to reduce the progress that gens had, well, behavior's options were super limited for what they could do. However, that all changed with the release of the Hag. Once Hag released with Hex perks, things shifted immediately. Hex Ruin took over the meta by storm because, for killers, that perk was like finding the holy grail. Passive generator slowdown that stopped gens from flying the second the match started? Sign me and the rest of the killer players up. The original version of Ruin was basically an answer to the prayers that many killer players had at the time. It significantly slowed down gen progression in the early game, and would typically force survivors to look for the Hex instead of just sticking on generators and hammering them out in a few seconds. It specifically punished newer players, as gens would regress every time you hit a good skill check, and would only retain progress when hitting great skill checks. This created a massive divide between the players who could hit those skill checks and the ones who couldn't, which again were typically newer players. Either you were capable of dealing with the perk, or you had to spend some time looking for it, assuming that one of the survivors didn't end up spawning on the totem, which did definitely happen a lot of the time. This would eventually lead to many problems when behavior started considering the new player experience, which we will get into in a little bit here, but at the time, well, the perk was actually necessary due to how broken the game really was. While other perks existed to slow down generator speed, none of them did it quite as effectively as Ruin, and that really showed any time you entered a match of DBD. It existed in almost every game. Killer players felt like they needed to run it, or they got absolutely decimated by any survivor capable of holding M1 on a generator. However, it was a Hex perk, and as we all know, Hex perks are incredibly inconsistent in terms of how long they last in matches. This created a big divide between the matches that Ruin lasted in and the ones that didn't. If Ruin was in a good spot, you were golden. But if survivors spawned on it, you wasted a perk slot. It was a huge gamble, as all Hex perks tend to be, but the positives outweighed the negative by a landslide. However, just because Ruin was now in the spotlight doesn't mean things didn't start changing. In February of 2017, the kick mechanic was added to the game. This meant that killers could now damage generators that were partially completed, allowing that generator to regress over a period of time until it was touched by a survivor. This on its own wasn't a big deal. Kicking generators didn't have that much of an impact unless you were absolutely sure it wasn't going to be touched for a while. What it did do though was open the floodgates for many perks to come. It was a new mechanic after all, and had a lot of potential that behavior quickly recognized. A new meta began shifting in the background, making itself more and more known with perks like Overcharge or even Surveillance, but it didn't become fully present until the addition of Pop Goes the Weasel, which was added with the Clown. Curtain Call was released in June of 2018, and immediately shifted the meta around the addition of the perk Pop Goes the Weasel, which regressed generators by 25% when kicking after hooking a survivor. Ruin was now paired with Pop for maximum generator protection, and within a couple months, a new meta was forged in the bowels of Dead by Daylight's design, the Ruin Pop meta of 2019, with the addition of Corrupt Intervention if you wanted to use it, which was also just as good. This combo inherently was absolutely amazing. You had Ruin for that early to mid-game slow slowdown, but you also paired it with pop for that post-hook regression. This covered about every situation the killer could find themselves in. If Ruin lasted, that was absolutely perfect. You could still kick generators at the time due to how Ruin worked, which meant you could definitely be getting value out of both of the perks. If Ruin was destroyed, well, you still had pop to do the heavy lifting for you. It was a match made in heaven. However, it was in that overuse of Ruin that things started getting noticed by behavior. You see, when players are using a perk in droves, behavior tends to notice that in their statistics, and this was no exception. As a result, they began taking another look at Ruin and why it was so used by a large chunk of killer players. However, instead of addressing gen speed in full, they instead decided to completely rework Ruin from the ground up, shifting the perk's design in some huge ways. Players understandably were pretty upset, as Ruin often felt necessary in most matches. However, they wouldn't stay upset for long, as the Ruin rework lent itself to something a bit more powerful. You see, Ruin's rework, despite how controversial it was, actually made it stronger. Well, for some killers, that is. The perk was changed to no longer punish newer survivors by making it necessary to hit great skill checks, but instead passively regress generators that weren't being touched by 200% for as long as the Hex totem stayed standing. This initially wasn't too impressive. It was a great perk, but was still susceptible to the shortcomings that Hex perks have, being the chance to get cleansed before you can get much value out of them at all. However, on its own, it was still good, but that quickly changed with the addition of the Descend Beyond chapter, which added the Blight, Felix, and most importantly for this video, Hex Undying. You see, Hex Undying was not like how it is today. These days, Undying only relights totems once, but on release, Undying would allow Hex perks to be transferred to different dull totems for as long as the Undying totem was still standing. This meant if you paired it with Ruin, as long as the survivors didn't find Undying specifically, the Hex totem would keep relighting over and over again, sending survivors on a wild goose chase to find the right totem and cleanse it so they could actually get rid of Ruin. It was insanely strong, especially on killers who specialized in map pressure, like Hillbilly, Spirit, or Blight at the time. However, even on the killers without those types of abilities, it was still immensely powerful. Pair that combo with Tinkerer and you had an absolutely insane build that was extremely hard to counter for the survivors. The strength of this combo did not go unnoticed though. Behavior could tell there was something wrong, and the extremely vocal survivor players made the issue pretty impossible to ignore. It only took until February of 2021 for Undying to be significantly nerfed, only having the ability to transfer a Hex totem once. After that, the perk would deactivate and you'd be back to square one. Surprisingly though, it wouldn't take long for another gen regression perk to take the spotlight. With the addition of the artist came the addition of Scourge hooks, which immediately changed the game for many killer players, specifically the perk Pain Resonance. In November of 2021, Pain Resonance was added to the growing list of options for gen regression, but unlike other perks, Pain Resonance activated on placing a survivor on a Scourge hook, which made it extremely easy to activate, assuming you had the Scourge hooks to do it. On release, Pain Resonance would activate every time you hooked a survivor, making it extremely powerful due to the 15% regression to whatever generator had the most progress at the time. Combine this with the Deathslinger perk Dead Man Switch, and you had a truly powerful combination of perks, especially due to a buff that DMS had gotten at the time. Combined with the fact that whatever survivor affected by Pain Resonance would scream and show their location to you, and you didn't even have to take a guess as to where to go next. The perk and the various combinations with it was one of the strongest matchups the game had, and it was no secret just how truly game-changing it could be in the right hands. Scourge hooks, and specifically Pain Resonance, actually stayed in power for a while. The perk was ever only truly nerfed in April of 2023, meaning it would have had a long time in the sun if it hadn't been for one of the worst gen defense metas we've ever seen. You see, the only real nerf Pain Resonance had at the time was removing the scream effects on survivors repairing whatever generator got hit with the perk, which was pretty tame compared to the murders we've seen of some other perks. No, the meta didn't shift because the perk got nerfed. The meta shifted because there was something much more dangerous cooking in the background. There's no killer meta that grinds my gears quite as much as the Gen Kick meta of 2022 does. I genuinely think it was one of the worst times to play Dead by Daylight. But why is that? Well, it all starts with the buffing of Eruption, a perk for Nemesis that allowed you to damage whatever generators you kicked by downing a survivor. On release, it wasn't too good, but after an incredible buff it got in July of 2022, it was pretty much unbeatable. The perk not only damaged any previously kicked generators by 10%, but also inflicted any survivors on said generators with the incapacitated status effect for 25 seconds once a survivor was downed. That meant for 25 seconds, the survivor literally couldn't interact with generators, totems, healing, or even using their items. The incapacitated status effect was a miserable one to be hit with, and there was no avoiding getting hit with the perk unless you were aware of what generators were kicked and when a survivor was about to go down. This made the perk miserable for anyone who wasn't on constant comms, and made the game a horrible experience altogether. But it doesn't even stop there. Once people began relying on Eruption like a prosthetic arm, they started looking for other Gen Kick perks to maximize its effectiveness. Enter Call of Brine, which made generators kicked by the killer regress by 200% of their normal speed. Enter Overcharge, which made generators regress faster over time, as well as giving survivors a skill check when working on a generator that was previously kicked. This perk combination was absolutely absurd and made it extremely difficult for the survivors to get any sort of objective progress done at all. It was insane, and in my opinion, the worst time to play the game for survivors. The reason I say that is because killers would spend most of the game kicking generators and would often not even take a lot of chases. They would be so focused on kicking generators and getting value from their perks that they would barely interact with the survivor side, but once they did, any survivors working on a generator would get punished. It was annoying as shit, and people were extremely angry with the state of the game for that reason. Most matches would devolve into 3 gens, and as you can imagine, that wasn't a fun situation to be in at all, especially considering the perks at play. Eventually, in March of 2023, Eruption was thoroughly nerfed to no longer make survivors incapacitated. Generators still lost progress when a survivor was put into the dying state, but other than seeing the aura of those survivors on one of the previously kicked generators, that was it. This killed the perk's pick rate and left it as a shattered mess of its former self, which is absolutely a good thing. However, Eruption wasn't the only casualty of this meta. As we all know, wars tend to come with a lot of casualties. Overcharge and Call of Brine were both extremely nerfed because of how much use they were seeing, and things quickly shifted back to the Pain Res Deadman Switch meta we talked about previously. But even that wasn't quite the same. In April of that same year, Pain Resonance was nerfed to only activate the first time each survivor was placed on a Scourge hook. It was still strong, and it was definitely a good change, but it also wasn't the perk it once was. But then a new meta showed its face. Before we get to the modern era, we have one more meta to discuss, the Pentimento and Thrill meta. You see, Pentimento had already been a perk for a while at that point, but was also not really in the spotlight because of it is very situational, as Hex perks often are. However, once Thrill of the Hunt was buffed to decrease cleansing and blessing speed by 14% in November of 2024, things got a bit out of hand. It was extremely common to combine those two perks with other Hex builds, such as Plaything, Ruin, or even Blood Fever to get as much use out of the build as physically possible. This meta was frustrating to go against, as it created a damned if you do, damned if you don't ultimatum for the survivors. If you cleanse the totems, you would just be giving the killer stacks of Pentimento. If you didn't, you'd be dealing with whatever Hex perks they brought into the match, the latter usually being the better option. There was just no winning, and considering that the first stack of Pentimento being a 30% reduction to repair speed was the most common one to be going against, well, it made the perk extremely strong for a large chunk of time. However, it only stayed like this for a few months. In May of 2025, Pentimento was nerfed into the ground, with the perk only adding a 3% additional slowdown to repair and healing speed per rekindled totem. The perk was still okay, but it was far from the glory days it once had. Even Thrill got a slight nerf, which did nothing to really help the shattered state that the meta fell into after Penti was initially nerfed. This points us towards today, where killers don't really have all that much bullshit in terms of gen regression. These days, gen regression in Dead by Daylight is actually in a really good state. You still have strong perks like Ruin, Pain Res, Pop, and Surge, all of which are really solid perks, but rarely feel as oppressive these days. There just aren't any ridiculous combos that need to be nerfed into the ground. The game is just fairly balanced for the most part. Well, in terms of generator regression, I'd actually say that the state the game is in now is really solid. Other than some odd outliers here and there, the game's pace feels much healthier and doesn't feel as artificially extended as it once did. There are good perks, but ones that feel understandable and easy to counter if you play it right. The problems that Dead by Daylight has now seem much more manageable and easy to deal with than they once did, and behavior is certainly better at dealing with these things in a timely manner than they once were, which is definitely one of the main reasons there are absolutely no insane, stupid metas in the game right now, which compared to everything else we've talked about today is definitely a good thing. I'd also say that killers coming out these days being much stronger contributes to this, as behavior doesn't really need to worry about making some super strong gen slowdown because, you know, they don't really need it that much anymore. Well, unless we're talking about Trapper or weaker killers who definitely still need gen regression. Going through the past of Dead by Daylight's gen defense has showed me just how much the game has improved in the many years of its release. It's still not perfect, obviously, but knowing about the rough spots the game has been in through the past is something that has enlightened me quite a bit. It's extremely easy to get bent out of shape due to some of the choices behavior has made over the years, and that's absolutely fair. But looking at the way the meta has evolved over the years, and behavior's constant attempts to address complaints about the game has reminded me just how capable they really are of listening to their player base and making good choices because of it. They don't get it right all the time, but there are certainly moments where they get pretty damn close. It'll be interesting to watch how the meta of chase-oriented perks we have now evolves over the years, and it'll certainly be interesting to watch how the new upcoming Stranger Things perks evolve the game's meta. But until then, that's it for me, gamers. Have a great day.